Call for Action presents Of Consuming Interest, a public service show that discusses scams, deceptive offers, and other consumer concerns. Here's the director of WJLA 7 Call for Action and your host, Shirley Rooker.
So, how far-reaching is woke? And what is woke? Well, we're going to talk about it and when it kind of impacts our investments, our healthcare, other things. We're going to be joined today by Will Hild, who is the Executive Director of Consumers Research. Very interesting subject that you're working on, Will. And I'd like for you to start out by giving us a brief overview of what consumer research is. You're a really old organization. You've been around for a long time. I take it you didn't start it.
No, I'm glad to say I didn't start it, or I probably wouldn't be here with you today. We're actually the nation's oldest consumer protection nonprofit, started in 1929. So we have a 90-plus year pedigree of looking out for the consumer and educating them on issues important to them. And so that's what I've tried to do. I took over the organization in March of 2020 with an idea of retooling the organization to really focus on this phenomenon of woke capitalism, which we believe, I think with a lot of evidence, that takes the focus of corporate America and a number of other different organizations off of serving consumers and onto serving woke politicians and woke activists. And so consumers are really the main people who are hurt by this.
Yeah, I don't like the idea of that in terms of my investments. And there's some examples and some lawsuits that have happened and a bunch of things that we're going to get to today. And we'll talk about the impact on investments. So woke is a new term. How would you describe woke?
Yeah, well, it's a new term. It was actually invented by the left. This was something that they originally used to describe themselves, but it's so summed up well a sort of new version of far left thinking and activities and an agenda that it was glommed on very quickly by people pushing back on it, like myself, to sort of very quickly, without having to list 5 or 10 bullet points of what it encompasses. People just generally kind of understand, if you're trying to put if you're trying to make every character in a Disney story gay, or race swap everybody, or you're trying to make an entire plot, a normal Grimm's fairy tale, if you're trying to turn it into a allegory for climate change, let's say, well, that's woke. It's sort of used to describe a large group of behaviors that are intentionally there to push a far left progressive agenda. And so that's generally what they describe.
So the concern here is when you start using a baseline to make investments, for example, that's something other than just the returns of the company, but rather how the company is run, what its policies are, what the company, even as far as what the company actually does. So those would be some of the things that would be included in the woke parameters when you're looking at what a company does. So now you all recently put out something about BlackRock and American Airlines. And I think, was there a lawsuit or something that happened here? Can you give us the information on that?
Yes, certainly. So in the context of investing, there's even a specific technical term for wokeness, and that's called ESG. And that's an acronym that stands for Environmental Social Governance. And really what it is, the far left, people like BlackRock will tell you that it's a type of investing strategy, much like value investing that Warren Buffett is famous for, or momentum investing or technicals investing. That is a lie. It is really a facade. It's a cover for using assets under management like BlackRock, which doesn't manage their own money, it manages other people's money, to push a far left progressive agenda. And so kind of the analogy I like to use is ESG is the disease and woke is the symptom. So when you see all of these companies like American Airlines, we'll get into that in a second, but also Nike, Coca-Cola, Disney, pushing this wokeness, even as it seems like their customer base is opposed to it and being offended by it. This ESG phenomenon helps explain the incentives that they're responding to, that these asset managers have put on corporate management to kind of push them in that direction. And it has gotten so bad, as you alluded to, that companies have started being sued for this activity. And in the context of American Airlines, the employees themselves, they sued because American Airlines had hired BlackRock to manage the pension fund of those employees. So in other words, if you're a worker at American Airlines, your money every month is going to, a little bit of it is going to your retirement account. That retirement account is being managed by BlackRock, or at least it was. BlackRock was using that money, whether you were in an explicitly ESG fund or not. In other words, even if you just had money in their S&P 500 fund, a totally vanilla, supposedly non-political investment, they were using that to push a political agenda across every company that they were invested in. And a federal judge in the Fifth Circuit found BlackRock liable for this activity, established that it is a violation of the fiduciary duty that they owe to the employees at American Airlines. And they even went a step farther, which is to say that the violation by BlackRock was so egregious and so obvious that the executives at American Airlines knew or should have known that this was going on, meaning for them to not even know would be negligent. They did know. It was so obvious. And the violations of fiduciary duty were so egregious that American Airlines now owes their employees some sort of recompense for having maintained BlackRock as their investment manager. Now, they're still in the damages phase of this, so we don't know exactly how much money they owe their employees, but it is an incredibly important ruling because it establishes for the first time in a judicial context that what BlackRock and other large asset managers like Vanguard and State Street have been doing, pushing this wokeness, is a violation of their fiduciary duty.
Well, so that becomes an ethical issue, it would seem to me, as well as an issue of actual financial returns for the people who are seeing their their pension funds managed by somebody who is looking at some parameter other than just making a profit for the investors. Would that be accurate?
That's 100% correct. And I will go a step further. In some ways, it's even worse than the way you described, because there's sort of two kinds of ESG. There is ESG where there is the term ESG or sustainable in the name of the fund you're investing in. Now, I think that's generally a bad idea. These funds don't make the returns that a normal investment does, but at least in theory, people investing in those funds know what they're investing in. That is a very small portion of the overall phenomenon I would describe as ESG, because you have firms like BlackRock being the largest and sort of the worst in this category that take all of their assets under management and use it to push woke objectives like what they call net zero, meaning the idea you're going to have zero carbon emissions, which for an airline is obviously fairly impossible. Okay, so if you have a dime of money invested with BlackRock, you have put your money towards an ESG investment thesis. You just haven't been fully informed of it. And so that's part of what BlackRock is doing is in my opinion, securities fraud. And that's not just me. There's been a number of different state securities commissioners who have agreed with that assessment and put are attacking them from a legal standpoint. But even worse than that, let's say you have no money with BlackRock, okay, but you have money in some of the companies that BlackRock is invested in, which is all of them, right? So anyone invested in the stock market is affected by this. BlackRock pushing these companies like Exxon, like Chevron, like all of the airlines to achieve net zero raises costs on consumers across the board and decreases shareholder returns across the board. So even if you don't have money with BlackRock, okay, you are being affected as a shareholder and as a consumer, most importantly, by their activities. And that's one of the ways I think it's particularly egregious what they're doing, is because even people who aren't snookered into giving their money to BlackRock or forced to do it by their employer are still being negatively affected by their activities.
Wow. Well, we're going to take a short break here to let our listeners know that they're tuned into Of Consuming Interest here on the Federal News Network. My guest today is Will Hild. He is the Executive Director of Consumers Research, which has been around even longer than Call for Action. We were established in 1963, so you really beat us out there, Will. Okay, so let's go back to talking about, you're talking about we can't even avoid the ESG investments because it's impacting everybody. I had no idea. I was thinking, okay, so if you don't have an investment with BlackRock, but you're saying that that's not true, that it's across the board. So let's move on to what is trying to be established now, and that is how this hurts the American consumer. But I would also think that it also hurts American business because the business may be performing great, but BlackRock may not choose to invest in them simply because, or to market them to their members simply because it doesn't fit their definition of woke. Would that be accurate?
Well, it's accurate in part. So, like I said, BlackRock has some funds that are labeled sustainable and or ESG, and in theory, at least, those funds are supposed to actually change the allocation of capital. In other words, they're going to buy companies that are, I'm just making this up, but they're going to buy companies that are in the windmill industry, and they're going to sell companies that are in the oil and gas industry. That's at least in theory what an ESG fund is doing. A lot of them don't even do that. They just slap an ESG label and raise the fees and don't do anything at all. But we'll give them the for the sake of argument, let's give the devil his due and say that's what they're doing. That is a very small portion of BlackRock's ESG activities. What is actually going on 90% of the time is you give your money to what you think is a non-ESG BlackRock fund. So you put, let's say, the SPY is their S&P 500 index fund, right? Those asset allocations aren't set by BlackRock. They're set by the Standard & Poor's 500 list, which is not even maintained by BlackRock. And so they take your money, let's say you give them $1,000, and they go buy, the proportional amount of shares for every company in that index. Every year, they do what they call corporate engagements, meaning they interact with the executives at those companies, okay, as major shareholders. They call up the CEO of Exxon or Chevron or American Airlines or Delta or whatever, and they say, as investors in your company, controlling maybe 8, 9, 10, 11, 12%, it varies, but they're usually the top shareholder in most companies because they're the largest asset manager. This is what we would like to see your company be achieving and trying to achieve. And then they insert a bunch of things that have nothing to do with either making returns or serving shareholders or serving consumers, excuse me. In fact, they usually are things that almost invariably are things that make the position of both shareholders and consumers worse. So let me give you some examples. One example is so-called net zero targets. This is the idea of getting your company's operations to be to generate net zero carbon emissions into the environment. BlackRock says that the reason that this is good business sense is because they take as a metaphysical fact that by 2050, they've all decided it's going to be 2050, every major government in the world will have mandated net zero as a matter of law. And so they claim that companies that are farther along in achieving net zero will do better under that legal situation than companies that are behind. And so that is the sort of made up reason they give for why they're allowed to push companies in this direction. Well, what's the problem with that? You say, if they hit net zero, who cares? The problem with that, let me give you an example with airlines. One of the things that's required to hit quote unquote net zero for an airline is to start using synthetic jet fuel that's been produced in a lab out, in a way that doesn't emit carbon. Those fuels are 3 to 5 times more expensive than traditional jet fuel, and jet fuel costs are about a third of the cost of running an airline. So imagine the cost of running an airline increasing by somewhere between 66 and 150%. What's that going to do to the returns for the shareholder, but even more importantly, to the cost of a ticket for a consumer? It's going to skyrocket. And so that's an example of how even if you don't have money invested with BlackRock, you're going to be hurt when they drive down the profit margins of those airlines, but you're going to be hurt even more as a consumer when you go to fly to see your grandmother next year, and the cost of those tickets are going up.
Oh, well, there goes my trip around the world. Oh my goodness, I'm kidding, but yes, I can see how that could impact us in a short 25 years, which oftentimes seems short in terms of our lives. Okay, so there's a whole lot of different issues that are impacted by how people are investing and whatnot. There's also been some concerns about, for example, how woke impacts healthcare. And for example, there's been some talk about the Cleveland Clinic, which is one of the preeminent health clinics in the country, or maybe even the world. Can you tell us about that and what it means?
Absolutely. I'm sorry to say that wokeness extends even past for-profit corporations into nonprofit corporations. And in this case, the Cleveland Clinic being a global health system, obviously centered in Cleveland, Ohio, but they have locations all over the country and in fact, all over the world. 3 of their board members are actually Saudi oil sheiks for that reason. But what we found in a lot of these healthcare systems is that you've had an invasion of wokeness on pretty much 3 major fronts. I mentioned the net zero front with the other stuff, so I won't belabor that point. But another thing we've seen is a fetishization of race and sex in terms of hiring and promotion, which is illegal under federal labor law, but still being practiced by a number of organizations, including Cleveland Clinic. They even committed at one point during the height of the BLM fever dream that they would help create, quote unquote, 1 million black jobs, high-end black jobs, which is, race and sex-based hiring quotas, again, are per se illegal under federal law. So it's pretty astonishing that a company would sign up to achieve something like that specifically. But they've also, I'm sorry to say, in this context of healthcare, dipped their toes into race and sex-based treatments of patients. In other words, differential treatments between people of different race and sex. They had programs specifically for minorities. They were not open to non-POC or non-whites patients, which is something that we're obviously attacked Cleveland Clinic for, but is not unique only to them. This is something, unfortunately, we've started to see as a trend in healthcare. And so we're pushing back on that as well. We believe that healthcare is obviously a consumer good as well. It's a vitally important one. It's obviously not the same as buying a Snickers, but it is an area where consumers need a lot of protection. And so we've been attacking Cleveland Clinic. And for those who'd like to learn more, they can visit clevelandclinicexposed.com to learn more about what we found at that institution. But I'm sorry to say that it is just another area where we have to fight this woke mind virus.
Will, give us the website, your website, where people can go to find other information about your organization.
Certainly. They can visit us at consumersresearch.org. That's consumersresearch.org. And they can follow us on Twitter at Consumers First. That's Consumers First on Twitter. And then, like I said, Cleveland Clinic Exposed, if they'd like to learn more about this specific issue.
You're listening to Of Consuming Interest on the Federal News Network. My guest today is Will Hild. He is the executive director of Consumers Research, which has been around since 1929, one of the first consumer organization. Call for Action was behind you all, though, and opening in 1963, Will. Anyway, very interesting subjects and how it impacts us on so many levels that we don't even think about. And I guess that the major concern of people perhaps listening to this is going to be retirement, and that is something that they need to watch out for. But is there any way that consumers can have an impact on this? To me, if I'm going to invest in a company, I want to look at their bottom line. I want to see what their performance level is. Now, are there values that can be assigned to these companies to tell me whether a woke company is performing as well as one that isn't? I mean, how do you go about determining whether or not its policies, its ESG policies, are impacting my returns?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to tell you the truth, if you have money invested at BlackRock or State Street, or in many cases Vanguard, your money is being used against your interests as we speak. All of those three companies have been the leaders in using corporate engagements, meaning the meetings that they have with corporate executives and boards, to push a far left political agenda that hurts returns and consumers. So my first advice would maybe move to another brokerage if you're any of those three, and to consider a different. Another thing that I highly recommend for investors to do is consider what they call direct indexing, which is where you're still availing yourself of the advantages of a index like an S&P 500 index and the diversity that entails, but you are owning the stocks directly. Because what's happening when you give your money to BlackRock is they're putting them in index funds, and then their fund managers are the ones doing the corporate engagement. If you own the stocks directly, you basically take some of that power out of the hands of the brokerages, and you do the voting. And so as people move towards maybe a direct indexing strategy, which a lot of brokerages are now Morgan Stanley, Fidelity will allow you to do this. You take some of the power out of those big asset managers who probably don't have your best interest in mind.
Well, this is a fascinating discussion, and it makes me know that I don't know very much and that I need to explore and to understand a little bit more how my investments are being managed and who's managing them and so on. And I guess that those should be transparent answers to us, but not always, as you say. Sometimes you have to look to see what's going on in companies. How far-reaching is this in terms of investments? What part, is there any way to determine what part of the investment world, what percentage or whatever, is being governed by ESG? Sounds like with BlackRock, which is the largest company in the world, I believe, in terms of investment. Is that right?
Yes, it is. And part of what makes that a hard question to answer is, like I said, that distinction between funds that have ESG on the label and funds that don't, but the asset managers use those stocks, the shares, to push a political agenda. So you look at a company like BlackRock, they have made public commitments to use all of their assets under management, no matter who the client is, to push things like net zero. And in 2017, Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, said that they use all of the shares under management to push DEI, to push race and sex-based quotas for hiring and promotion at every company they're invested in. So if you take their public statements, I'm sorry to say that a large portion of the universe of publicly traded stocks is now managed under sort of an ESG style of governance. It's less than it was 4 or 5 years ago. We're not the only group that's pushing back on it, but I think we have been sort of the tip of the spear. And I'm happy to say that progress has been made. I want to be very clear about this to any of your listeners. People should not walk away from this feeling disempowered or like they're up against a Goliath that cannot be defeated. All of these companies are violating the law when they use your money to push a far left political agenda, when they use your state's pension funds, which we didn't really get a chance to talk about, but that's where a large portion of this money comes from. They are breaking the law. They are violating securities. They're committing securities fraud. They are violating antitrust because a lot of them are coordinating when they do this. And lastly, they're violating their fiduciary duty, like what we spoke about in the case against American Airlines. So really what this comes down to is about educating oneself as an investor, but also as a citizen, and encouraging your elected representatives to push back on this. They will cave because they are already violating the law. They've only gotten away with this because we haven't been watching the chicken coop. And so as we are able to put more pressure on them, they're going to back away from all this stuff.
So the real thing for the investor is to learn about what your investments are, where they're going, how they're being used. I mean, a lot of people, I don't know whether I am informed or not. And I know enough to be scared. How's that? So anyway, but the best place to go to get some great information in there is to go to consumersresearch.org. You've got all of it there, and also a nice history of your founder, M. Stanton Evans, whom I think a lot of people in Washington know from his broadcast days. And, I didn't realize that he was the founder until I went to your website and started checking on it. Well, that's just about it for us. Well, I can't believe the time has flown by. So just to let people know, they can go to your website again to get information, be informed. That's the big thing. Would you say that would be the underlying factor in us in looking in wise investments, is to know what we're doing?
Absolutely. And I'll just add one quick thing. If we've got like 10 more seconds, we have a service called Woke Alerts that you can sign up for on our website. We won't bombard you. I promise the maximum we ever text people is once a week, but it's a text message-based service. We inform consumers on the companies that are most betraying their interests by going woke, cozy up to woke politicians. But we don't just send it to you to upset you or to make you feel bad about the state of society. We always encourage people to both use their wallet and their voice in pushing back against wokeness. And part of our woke alerts is always the ability to contact the company in question and push back. And that has had measurable, significant changes at the companies we've targeted. It's not about us as an organization.
Thank you, Will. We're out of time. Thank you so much for being here today. Very interesting. I got to go to learn a lot more. You've been listening to Of Consuming Interest here on the Federal News Network. My guest has been Will Hild. He is the Executive Director of Consumers Research. Thank you for joining us.
Of Consuming Interest is a public service program presented by WJLA 7 Call for Action, hosted by Shirley Rooker. Call for Action is an international nonprofit network of hotlines which offer free and confidential assistance. If you have a complaint, contact Call for Action at 301-652-HELP. That's 301-652-HELP.